the Prime Minister, Mark Austin, is
Goodbye, good luck, and if I got it wrong, I'm sorry. Tony Blair says farewell to the nation.
On the 27th of June, I will tender my resignation from the office of Prime Minister to the Queen. Hand on heart, I did what I thought was right. It has been an honour to serve it. I give my thanks to you, the British people, for the times that I've succeeded, and my apologies to you for the times I've fallen short.
It was reflective, at times apologetic, and always emotional. A speech from the heart. I'm live in Downing Street at the end of an historic day as the man who's lived here for 10 years prepares to give way to the man who's lived just over there for just as long. But he still has 7 weeks to wait. The Prime Minister outlined many of his achievements today, but will Iraq be his only real legacy?
The legacy that I have is a son whose life was cruelly taken.
He promised things would get better. We asked people on the front line of the public services whether they have. And advice from an old friend: what should a retired politician do next?
I think he and his family ought to take some time, take a deep breath, be grateful for their lives, and then decide, you know, what he cares about, where he can still have an impact, and just go after it.
Good evening from a rain-swept Downing Street tonight. The wind of change is certainly blowing through here, and there was something different about Tony Blair today as he announced he'll be leaving Number 10 on June the 27th. Humble, defensive, apologetic, as he gave his own appraisal of his decade in Downing Street. He chalked up and talked up his achievements, of course he did, but he asked the public to make their own assessment on decisions like Iraq. It's your call, he said. He apologised for the times he'd fallen short. Hand on heart, he said, I did what I thought was right. Coming up on this specially extended programme, On the Move with Alastair Campbell, Mr Blair's close confidant and media maestro, on his old boss moving on. His old friend Bill Clinton on their special relationship and surviving life after office. And Rory Bremner will be giving me his impressions of the Blair premiership. But first tonight, let's head to Sedgefield, as the Prime Minister did this morning, his patch, and join our political editor Tom Bradby for his assessment of Mr Blair's speech on this dramatic day. Tom.
Well, Mark, it was a vintage Blair performance. He really does have a unique ability to pitch a speech just perfectly for the occasion. It was very striking when he said, hand on heart, I want you to know that I did what I thought was right. It was tempting to say at that point, how many Prime Ministers do you know who spent a lot of time doing what they thought was wrong? It's not what you think is right that counts, it's whether you get it right. And I think the question tonight is whether issues like Iraq will rob Mr Blair of the chance of being considered a great Prime Minister. Whatever the truth, it's too late now, because today was effectively the end. His critics always said he was never really a Labour man at heart. Too posh, too public school, too much like a Tory. But tell that to members of the Trimdon Labour Club today. He is, and always has been, their boy.
Our local MP, Tony Blair.
This morning he came to say goodbye, and what a farewell it was. Passionate, at times tearful, full of self-justification, of course, but shot through with a rare humility. Watched by his wife and children, whom he fulsomely thanked, he said 10 years was enough.
Today I announce my decision to stand down from the leadership of the Labour Party. The party will now select a new leader. On the 27th of June, I will tender my resignation from the office of Prime Minister to the Queen. I've been Prime Minister of this country for just over 10 years. In this job, in the world of today, I think that's long enough for me, but more especially for the country. And sometimes the only way you conquer the pull of power is to set it down.
He talked of his achievements, but he knew, as we all do, that it has not ended where it began.
Expectations were so high. Too high, probably. Too high in a way for either of us. And now in 2007, you can easily point to the challenges or the things that are wrong or the grievances that fester.
He didn't mention Iraq there, but he didn't need to. It seemed to underlie so much of what he said today.
I was and remain as a person and as a Prime Minister an optimist. Politics may be the art of the possible, but at least in life, give the impossible a go. So, of course, the visions are painted in the colours of the rainbow, and the reality is sketched in the duller tones of black and white and grey. But I ask you to accept one thing. Hand on heart, I did what I thought was right. I may have been wrong. That's your call. But believe one thing, if nothing else. I did what I thought was right for our country.
People claimed it was a tough job, he said, but not really.
I've been very lucky and very blessed. And this country is a blessed nation. The British are special. The world knows it. In our innermost thoughts, we know it. This is the greatest nation on earth. So it has been an honor to serve it. I give my thanks to you, the British people, for the times that I've succeeded, and my apologies to you for the times I've fallen short. But good luck.
So there it is. The man a generation has come to know simply as the Prime Minister is off. The great communicator is leaving the stage.
Well, today's events had been carefully choreographed, of course. What we hadn't expected was the apologetic tone of Mr. Blair's speech. So why did he say what he said? Our political correspondent, Libby Wiener, has spent the day finding out. Libby.
Yes, self-belief is an essential characteristic of any successful Prime Minister, and Tony Blair had it more than most. But today expressed an element of self-doubt, at least about the verdict of his people, perhaps his way of saying sorry.
I may have been wrong. I may have been wrong. I may have been wrong.
So was he really trying to say sorry for this, Iraq? Certainly it was a more humble Tony Blair than we had seen before.
Do you think that's what he was trying to say, to apologise perhaps for Iraq?
I think expectations were very high when we came into government, and I think Tony was trying to say, look, we haven't been able to do all of the things that people wanted us to do, and I, as Prime Minister, have not been able to do all of those things. And I think that was a very honest and straight thing for him to say.
My apologies to you for the times I've fallen short.
Fallen short? What could he mean by that? One of his predecessors as Labour leader felt it was a way of putting Iraq behind him.
Included in his view of what he called fallen short would be the outcome thus far in Iraq, far, far, far from what he wanted and what he thought he was striving for.
And expectations were so high. Too high, probably. Too high in a way for either of us.
A fair assessment. This man, his one-time opponent, was bound to agree with that.
He has enormous political skills, of course, a very successful leader of his party in electoral terms, not a successful leader of the country in terms of achieving what he actually said he was going to do.
But Tony Blair's most loyal followers, out in strength today, were having none of it.
He's learned some lessons, and the most important thing is stand up for the things that you believe in. There's two sorts of Prime Minister. There's Prime Ministers who go with the flow, and there are Prime Ministers who make the weather. Tony Blair makes the weather.
Hand on heart, I did what I thought was right.
Right, back now to our political editor up there in Trimdon. Tom, in 10 years of speeches, how does this one rank?
Well, I think it was exceptionally good because once again it struck exactly the right mood for the occasion. For my money, he was really apologising for Iraq today. He didn't say that, but that's what I think he was doing. I spent a lot of time around him over the last couple of years. I just don't think he wants to apologise for everything else. I think he feels he's been right about, excuse me, most of the other big issues. I think people have been a little harsh about him in some ways over the last few weeks. There are lots of successes you can point to over the last decade. The economy's gone well. Of course, some of that was global forces. Some of that even was what the Tories put in place before, but he has overseen that. I find it amusing when people say that the public services haven't improved. I think it's unquestionable that they have, and he's pumped a lot of money into them. But I think the point is, you know, history judges you very harshly if you make big errors. And, you know, Iraq wasn't like Suez. It was much worse than that, potentially, I think, when we look at it at this point. And I think people will find it very, very hard to forgive him for that.
Right, so what about the man who wants to move from over there in number 11 into number 10? He's been keeping a pretty low profile recently, but today Gordon Brown did praise what he called Mr. Blair's unique achievements.
I think I spoke for millions of people when I said at the Cabinet today that Tony Blair's achievements are unique, unprecedented and enduring. Many people will remember how he led the country after July the 7th, how he responded for the whole world after September the 11th in America, how he responded to the tragic death of Princess Diana. But over 10 years, his enduring legacy will also be that he built better public services, a strong economy, that Britain's reputation in the world is stronger than ever before. At all times, he tried to do the right thing.
So, Tom, what do you think Gordon Brown's going to say tomorrow?
Well, funnily enough, I think you're going to see him striking a very, very similar tone. I think the order of the day, his humility, I understand he's going to end by saying, this is my message, I will listen, I will learn, I will never forget your aspirations. I think it's important tomorrow. He's going to have a very hectic day. He's going to be belting around southern England, and he's going to be concentrating on marginal seats the Labour Party needs to win. Now that and what he's going to say is important. Most analysts point out that there are lots of people in the English suburbs who simply don't feel Gordon Brown is interested in them and their aspirations. He's really got to nail that, and he will start trying to do that tomorrow.
All right, Tom, thank you very much for that. Now, later on in this specially extended ITV News.
And coming up, Blair on Blair, sort of.
But first, Mr. Blair didn't spell it out, but when he acknowledged I may have been wrong, he was talking about Iraq. It overshadowed the final years of his premiership. It certainly cost him his popularity and perhaps ultimately his job. 4 years on, the bloodshed continues. Today, 26 civilians were killed or found dead across Iraq. His critics say it wasn't just the decision that was wrong, it was the way he reached it and how he justified it. Our senior correspondent James Mates now on the legacy of Iraq.
Shock and awe, one of the defining images of the Blair decade. Historians may come to regard it as the defining image, because it was in this one moment, the attack on Iraq, that people's faith and, more importantly, trust in Tony Blair began to crumble.
Since the Iraq War, bluntly, millions of Britons have no longer believed Tony Blair to tell the truth, not only about Iraq, but on anything else.
It was clearly not necessary, and it wasn't just. And I think if you involve our armies in warfare, it must be just.
Iraq did for Tony Blair. He was finished after that cataclysmic era, and everything after that was just treading water.
There is nothing else that explains how a 3 times election winner fell so fast in public esteem. On almost every other issue, he's remained effortlessly in touch with public opinion. In his 10 years, there's been no major economic crisis, no Black Wednesday, no poll tax, neither personal scandal nor overwhelming atmosphere of sleaze. And on the event that was to define the early years of the 21st century, the attacks of 9/11, Tony Blair both reflected and articulated Britain's public mood.
This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism.
If Tony Blair had been run over by a bus a week after 9/11, history would have said here was a man who understood Britain's relationship with America and was popular for it. Blair was immensely popular on both sides of the Atlantic in the way he responded to 9/11. But since then, certainly as far as the British public is concerned, he's got it badly wrong. He's seen as a poodle to a particularly right-wing American president that the British public despise.
From the moment 9/11 happened, Tony Blair agreed with George Bush that the rules had changed. He sent British troops to fight alongside the Americans in driving the Taliban and Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan. But then he went much further. He bought into the neoconservative Bush doctrine that the only way to fight the threat of terror was preemptive war, with Saddam Hussein the first target.
He believed that the job of a British Prime Minister was never, repeat, never publicly ever to say anything remotely critical of an American president, but to try to work behind the scenes to do a little bit of good. Quite frankly, George Bush took him for a ride.
I think he faced a growing unpopularity and an anger within the British people that they were definitely duped over the reasons for going in. I do think the British people felt let down, and you can't fool the British people. They love their armed forces, and if they see them deployed somewhere which they don't feel is necessary, then they will inevitably turn against the government.
And the war in Iraq refused to end. British troops continued to fight and to die for a cause the public back home found increasingly unconvincing. And as they did so, the government's case for war began to collapse amidst dodgy dossiers, sexed-up intelligence, and the suicide of Dr. David Kelly, one of Britain's top specialists on Iraq's weapons. And with every month, every week the war went on, the damage this did to Tony Blair continued to grow.
If things don't turn around for the better in Iraq, then the legacy will be failure in the Middle East and failure in Asia, and all the other good things that he has done in the Balkans and in Africa and on fighting world hunger. All that will be eclipsed by failure.
I would say what legacy? From my point of view, the legacy that I have is a son whose life was cruelly taken by a roadside bomb in Basra in 2005. And that is the legacy he's left me.
Well, during the build-up to the invasion of Iraq, Alastair Campbell was at Mr. Blair's side as he reached his decision that Britain and British troops should be part of it. Today, loyal as ever, he defended that decision and denied the Blair years were dominated by a culture of spin. Called the King of Spin, Alastair Campbell was as close as anyone to the Prime Minister as he made the crucial decisions of his premiership. I caught up with him on a busy day to find out how he thinks history will judge them. You must be pretty disappointed. 3 election victories, some remarkable achievements, and yet as he leaves, people are talking about spin, about sleaze, and about Iraq.
Well, I think you are. I think lots of people are talking about lots of different things. And, I thought Tony's speech in Sedgefield kind of, it tried to cover all the waterfront. He was saying there's been fantastic change in the country, which there has, and I don't think anybody can deny that, but also saying there are difficult issues he had to deal with that have fundamentally divided the country and still do. And I think the spin thing's overdone. I think the whole...
Well, you would say that, wouldn't you?
No, well, I only say it because I believe it. I really do.
But you and Tony Blair spun Iraq, the so-called dodgy dossier. I mean, this is when the people of this country started to get disillusioned. If you're spinning something as serious as Iraq and then having to apologise for it afterwards, you must regret that. Tony Blair must regret it.
Look, after Iraq, he won a 3rd general election, and he won it with a pretty good majority.
But so people were pretty disillusioned with Iraq.
Some people were disillusioned. Some people were really, really angry about Iraq, and they still are. But as he at least give him the respect he deserves, and I think was absolutely clear in that speech today, that you can question his decision, but it's the questioning of the motive that I find offensive.
On May the 2nd, 97, you must have thought ahead and thought, what kind of legacy do we want for Tony Blair? As you sit in this taxi now, what do you think his legacy is, and how does it differ from the legacy that you want?
It's funny, he was talking about the expectations on May the 2nd, and I can remember really clearly Jonathan Powell and I were in a car behind Tony and Cherie going down Gower Street, And I'll never forget this. We were driving down Gower Street, and people who were obviously following it live on television. There was almost like a cascade out of the doorways as people were coming out to cheer and clap and all the rest of it. And Jonathan, I can remember the conversation we were having and saying, you know, God, this is just like, you know, this is so over the top in terms of, you know, what people were feeling. And it was like, you know, everything's going to be put right tomorrow. And I think, as I say, you go back to what the Labour Party promised in 1997, and a phenomenal amount of it has been achieved.
But isn't that the tragedy of Tony Blair's premiership? All those achievements will be overshadowed by one thing, and that's Iraq.
I think that's kind of the media script for today. You've all decided the line on Tony Blair's leadership is he did some great things at the start, and then along came Iraq.
Well, it's a pretty dominant theme.
Yeah, it may be, but I mean, look, you can point to all sorts of things in Tony Blair's leadership. You can point to a minimum wage, you can point to Scottish Parliament and the biggest constitutional programme any of us have known. You can point to the longest period of sustained economic growth in our lifetime and beyond. You can point to peace in progress in Northern Ireland, something so many
but historians will point to Iraq.
Historians will point to all of that and plenty more. You can't say what history will decide any more than I can. Iraq has been a big, important part of Tony Blair's time in office. Of course it was. It was the most difficult call that he had to make. I still defend it, and I will continue to defend it. And I think Tony has, as he said today, has always tried to do the right thing for the country. And sometimes the country may disagree, but he's always done it, I think, with the best of motives.
Alastair Campbell talking to me earlier. Now, Mr. Blair doesn't want Iraq to be his defining decision. He made clear today he wants to be remembered for the improvements he believes he's made to people's lives and living standards. Here's a reminder of what he said earlier.
There is only one government since 1945 that can say all of the following: more jobs, fewer unemployed, better health and education results, lower crime and economic growth in every quarter. Only one government, this one.
Now, we've tried to put his claim to the test. Our business correspondent Mark Eddo has been finding out from experts in the fields of crime fighting, education and health whether it was money well spent.
Back in 1997, Tony Blair promised to radically improve the National Health Service, rejuvenate education and drastically reduce crime. But after a decade of record public spending, have we had value for money? We asked 3 leading figures to give the man who spent 10 years at number 10 his marks out of 10.
Few issues mattered more to Tony Blair than law and order. Figures show crime has fallen by 35% since 1997. But that's not the whole picture, says Chris Fox, arguably the nation's top policeman during Blair's reign. Chris was president of the Association of Chief Police Officers.
5 years before Blair became Prime Minister, he said he would be tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. Was he?
I think he understood crime. But unfortunately, behind him, an organisation grew up around performance management, measurement, where what was being measured was not always relevant to what was needed to be done.
Ticking boxes.
Ticking boxes. For example, in the early days, it was a case of how fast you can answer the telephone, how fast you get to an incident. Well, officers were ticking those boxes. It didn't matter what you did when you got to the incident, the service you gave, how you investigated, as long as you got there.
10 years of Tony Blair at number 10, marks out of 10.
Well, for Tony Blair himself, 7 or 8, because of his personal commitment and his leadership and his willingness to get involved and understand the whole of crime. For Tony Blair's government, because of the organisations that set up around him to support that, probably 5.
So Blair gets an average of 6 out of 10 for spending on crime. But what about education? Blair spent billions more than the previous government. Well, consider Phoenix High. It was once called the worst school in England, but superhead William Atkinson has turned it, incredibly, into one of the most improved.
I think largely it was money well spent. The system now is better, significantly better than it was in 1997. They've achieved quite a lot. There's a lot more to achieve, especially for the disadvantaged young people in our society.
You're saying that money has been well spent?
Largely well spent.
Largely. OK, where could they have done better?
take a school around the corner like Westminster School. Fantastic school, yeah? You know, you have classes there of 10 to 12. You go to a good comprehensive in the inner city and you have classes of 30. You have the most advantaged members of our community having additional advantage thrust at them. Yet the disadvantaged are the ones who are scrabbling around. We've got to change that.
So a decade of education under Mr. Blair, what mark would you give him?
I would give them 6.5 out of 10, yeah, which is better than average, yeah, but not quite good enough.
So a could do better mark for education spending. But no sector has enjoyed as much government largesse as the NHS, or received as many negative headlines. The government deserves the flack, says one of the world's leading cancer specialists, Professor Carol Sikora.
The money, huge amounts, were introduced early part of this decade, but no reform. There was no competition. The same old public sector bureaucracy exists now as it did 10 years ago. These are the things that are consuming the large amounts of money. The front line gets very little of it.
Well, certainly the Labour government thinks they have something to crow about. They're saying waiting lists have been slashed, cancer deaths are down. The Health Secretary said this is the best year for health ever.
I'd say rubbish. The problem they have is introducing a large amount of money without the reform strategy right at the beginning.
What would you give him, marks out of 10?
Absolutely top marks for the amount of money put in, fairly low marks for not reforming the structure before putting that money in, and very low marks for keeping the staff on board and motivating them. The total score 4 out of 10.
The lowest mark goes to the sector that saw the biggest spend. So those were the views of some of the frontline troops. The average mark they gave Tony Blair for the billions he spent in his 10 years at number 10? A modest 5.5 out of 10. Mark Eddo, ITV News.
Now, as you know, Rory Bremner is a man of many faces. One of them, of course, is that of the Prime Minister. Earlier this evening, I asked him what he thought of today's speech.
Well, I think we all know this is what Tony Blair does best. I mean, he does do these very, very good speeches, and but we've now sort of entered the Sinatra phase of the government, really. And it's like, this is not a time for sound bites, but now the end is near, and as I face the final curtain, and he must have been going through the drafts of that speech going, regrets, I have a few, but then again, too few to mention. This is going to be the most stage-managed departure. It's now going to be 5-6 weeks, I think. So we wake up tomorrow and Tony Blair will still be Prime Minister, the day after that, the week after that. And I think what we're seeing is history being written and rewritten as we speak. The sound, the television, radio channels today were full of Philip Gould and Alastair Campbell and all the Blair outriders. And I think what we're seeing is history being rewritten and the Blair legacy being written on the television and radio screens as we speak.
But you've done him so well for so long, you'll miss him, won't you?
In a strange way. I mean, I've always felt the strange thing. I mean, there have been achievements. I mean, clearly he's timed this just to come after the Northern Ireland thing, and there have been a lot of achievements. I've always felt about Blair that he's like the girl with the curl, you know, in the nursery rhyme. That when he's good, he's very, very good, and when he's bad, he's horrid. And it's a question really about whether the horrid bits, that trust and Iraq, will outweigh the others, and maybe that's something that history, you know, will tell us, and that's something that I'll be busy writing as soon as I've left Downing Street, I guess.
Well, you must be practicing your Gordon Brown now. How's that going? Give us a taste of that.
Well, clearly we are working, but don't forget we inherited the most encouraging and optimistic set of economic statistics any incoming government has had, and it's taken us time to turn that round. But I'm looking forward to a chance over the next few weeks and months, and however long I have to rectify that situation. I think we'll have fun. Although I've never entirely enjoyed doing Tony Blair as much as John Major or as Michael Howard, which were very enjoyable characters. And I don't know whether that's because Tony Blair isn't an inherently comic figure. In some ways he's a tragic figure, and we've seen that journey that he's gone on that he described today. And I think we've had fun with the characters like Prescott and Robin Cook, and there's been some very colourful characters, and those are all going as well, and John Reed's going. So it's going to be rather a dull and bland time, and so in that sense I'll miss him. He has been a huge colossus on the political stage, for good or ill, and he's really governed the country for the last 10 years by the sheer force of his own personality, and I think that maybe will be his legacy. It'll be, as it always was, all about him.
All right, Rory Bremner, we've enjoyed having you on tonight. Thanks very much for joining us. Thank you. Well, throughout Mr Blair's leadership, one man's fortunes have been bound up with those of Tony Blair. That man, of course, is his deputy for a decade, John Prescott. They started together, so they finished together. Mr Prescott has announced he's leaving too. Our chief political correspondent, Daisy McAndrew, on how he'll be remembered.
It's always been said opposites attract, and theirs was a partnership built to last. And it did, for more than a decade. The deputy leader's down-to-earth manner a sharp contrast to his leader's slick and spin style. Saying goodbye tonight, it's hard to imagine any successor filling his boots.
Traditional values in a modern setting, that's what's governed this party, and I'm proud to have been the Deputy Prime Minister. I'm proud to have been the Deputy Leader in those 10 years.
To some, he was good old Labour stock. To others, an embarrassing laughing stock.
I'll be in trouble again, I think, now.
But his habit of getting into trouble never seemed to bother him or his wife Pauline. Until this, the affair with Tracy, the secretary. His wife wasn't impressed, the Labour Party wasn't impressed, and according to the tabloids, even poor Tracy hadn't been much impressed. Proud of his working class roots and life on the great ocean liners as a ship steward, taunts from the Conservative benches like "mine's a gin and tonic" left Prescott with a hatred of the Tories.
For many Tories, morality means not getting caught.
And it was that passion, so invaluable to Tony Blair, that landed him in the stickiest of situations. Never one to walk away from a fight, political or other. Even those on the end of his blows had a soft spot for him.
I hold no grudges. I've got no vendetta or any. I nearly sent him an Easter egg once the first year. I very nearly sent him an Easter egg, but I bottled it at the last minute.
Often teased for jumbling up his words by the liberal intelligentsia he despised, in fact he's a politician who doesn't need them, for it's pictures and passion more than anything else that tell the tale of this huge character. Daisy McAndrew, ITV News.
So there we are. In a moment, President Clinton's advice to his old friend on life after office. But now let's join Katie in the studio with tonight's other news.